Welcome to Season 3 of CSS Breakdown, book by book. In this first episode, we begin our journey through Michael Kimmel's influential work, The Gendered Society. Kimmel challenges the deeply rooted belief that men and women are fundamentally different by nature, and instead reveals how these differences are constructed and maintained by unequal social structures. Okay, so let's take a deep dive into the introduction of a book that, well, it's really shifted how a lot of people think about gender. Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society.
That's right. And this isn't just, some dusty academic text. It's really become a foundational book. It's been translated into loads of languages, multiple editions, now up to the fourth edition from 2011, which shows it has real staying power.
Right.
And its main goal, like right from page 1, is to seriously grapple with gender inequality and, maybe counterintuitively, to understand how that inequality itself produces the very differences we often just assume are, well, natural.
And that core question he throws out there immediately is just huge, isn't it? It's the one we've all debated forever. Are men and women fundamentally, inherently different, sort of like creatures from different planets?
Yeah, the Mars-Venus idea.
Exactly. Or are the differences we see mostly created by society, and specifically by the unequal structures within that society? I mean, how does he even start to unpack something that massive right there in the introduction?
Well, the intro really acts as a kind of roadmap for the whole book. He lays out his core argument, a thesis that honestly flips the script on a lot of conventional wisdom.
Okay.
He starts by challenging some of our most deeply held beliefs about why men and women seem so distinct, and also why male dominance is just so widespread, globally.
Uh-huh.
And he also gives us a preview of how the rest of the book will delve into gender by looking at it through different lenses. You've got biology, culture, our big social institutions, and even just our everyday interactions.
And he makes it personal right away, doesn't he? I remember reading that he talks about his own experience, as a dad, watching his son navigate the world and figure out what it means to be a boy, and then, later, a man.
Oh, absolutely.
That personal bit, it immediately makes you think, okay, how do these big abstract concepts actually play out in real lives?
Absolutely. That personal touch is really key, I think.
Yeah.
It grounds the academic discussion and reminds us that these aren't just theories, they're lived experiences, right? It's about the pressures, the expectations, the performances of gender that shape people from the earliest age.
So our mission then for this deep dive is to really dig into those foundational arguments Kimmel makes right there in the introduction.
Yep.
We want to get a clear handle on that crucial distinction he makes between sex and gender and challenge some of those, common sense ideas we have about difference automatically leading to dominance. And really understand his powerful argument that gender inequality isn't just a result of us being different, but it's actually the engine that produces the differences we see.
And, as we do this, it's important to stay mindful of those assumptions we all carry. Kimmel really asks us to confront them head on.
Okay.
So let's maybe start by looking at just how pervasive this idea of difference and inequality really is in our everyday thinking.
Okay, yeah, let's jump into that first major idea, the pervasiveness of perceived difference and inequality. Kimmel points out how common it is, almost reflexive, to think about men and women as fundamentally separate. He uses that popular interplanetary metaphor. You mentioned men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
Right. That view, which got super popular with books like John Gray's, basically suggests that the differences between men and women are just vast and inherent.
Like hardwired.
Exactly. We're told we think differently, feel differently, communicate differently, have totally different needs, desires, the whole 9 yards. It paints this picture of men and women as almost alien to each other, constantly struggling to bridge this immense gap.
Gray literally says, we think, feel, perceive, react, respond, love, need, and appreciate differently. I mean, it makes you wonder how we manage to share a planet, let alone, a house or an office.
But, and this is the immediate counterpoint Kimmel throws in, despite these supposedly vast inherent differences, men and women function side by side in the exact same shared social spaces every single day.
Okay.
We compete for the same jobs, right? The same promotions in workplaces. We're evaluated by the same criteria, mostly. We sit in the same classrooms, get graded by the same standards. We share homes, raise kids together, pay the same bills, read the same news.
So the actual reality of our shared lives seems to kind of contradict that narrative of fundamental, planetary difference.
Precisely. And this leads straight into Kimmel's core assertion. It's a really crucial insight right at the start. Gender isn't just a way of classifying people into male and female. It is, first and foremost, a system, a system that expresses and reinforces universal inequality between women and men.
Wow, okay. Universal inequality.
Yeah. So when we talk about gender, Kimmel argues, we are kind of by definition talking about hierarchy, about power dynamics, about inequality. It's not just about difference, it's about ranked difference.
That immediately shifts the focus, doesn't it, from just describing traits to analyzing power structures. Okay, so building on this, Kimmel says there are two central questions that any serious look at gender in society has to ask.
Yes, exactly. The first one is why? Why is it that in pretty much every known society, people are differentiated based on gender? Why is gender such a fundamental organizing principle of social life? Used as a basis for dividing up tasks, roles, expectations. Why are men and women seen as distinct categories everywhere?
That seems like the most basic question, doesn't it? Why gender at all? Okay, and the second key question.
The second one, just as important, is this. Given that gender is used for differentiation, why is male dominance virtually universal? Why is it that across almost all known societies, resources, social, political, economic, are divided unequally?
Yeah.
With men consistently holding more power and getting, well, a bigger slice of the pie. And tied to that, why is the division of labor based on gender also almost always an unequal division, where the work typically assigned to women is valued less economically, socially, than the work assigned to men?
So it's not just are we different, but why are we treated as different in a way that consistently leads to men having more power and more resources?
That's the absolute core of it.
Yeah.
And, while the basic facts, this perceived difference in male dominance, are remarkably consistent globally, Kimmel adds an important nuance here.
Okay.
Societies vary dramatically in the specific types of differences they emphasize, right? And the level of inequality they enforce, and even sometimes the amount of force or violence needed to keep the system going. But that fundamental pattern, the link between gender difference and male dominance, it persists.
That really sets the stage for challenging how we usually explain this pattern, which I guess brings us to that classic age-old debate.
Exactly. Let's move into how Kimmel tackles the prevailing explanations, often framed as, the nature versus nurture debate. Are the differences hardwired by biology, or are they taught through society? Is biology destiny, or is human nature actually pretty flexible and shaped by our environment?
Let's maybe look at the nature argument first, that biological determinism view. What does that usually emphasize?
Right. The nature argument, which Kimmel discusses as a view he explores later in the book, Chapter 2 specifically, it focuses on biological variations between the sexes, things like our different anatomies, hormone levels, maybe even subtle differences in brain structure or musculature.
Okay.
The core assumption here is that these biological facts are somehow fixed, unchangeable, and that they naturally, almost automatically, provide the foundation for male power and control.
So the thinking goes, men are physically stronger on average, or have different hormones that make them inherently more aggressive or dominant, and boom, that's why they end up in positions of power. Simple as that.
That's the common line of reasoning, yeah. However, and this is crucial, Kimmel introduces a significant nuance right away. He readily acknowledges that biological differences do exist. Of course they do. The anatomical, hormonal, physiological differences we use to classify biological sex are real.
Right, sex differences.
Yes, sex differences. But, he points out, there is enormous variation within each sex category. You'll find plenty of women who are physically stronger than many men. Hormone levels like testosterone or estrogen vary widely for individuals of both sexes, and they fluctuate throughout life, too. Even those ideas about brain structure and function being strictly binary, male brain versus female brain, they're often way oversimplified. Men and women tend to use both sides of their brains, for instance. The overlap is huge.
So the biological reality is actually much messier, much more overlapping than the simple male versus female biology stereotype suggests.
It really is. And Kimmel's critique goes deeper than just pointing out the overlap. He argues that it's, quote, far from clear how these biological differences, even if they exist on average, automatically translate into male domination.
How so?
Well, why should physical strength inherently lead to social power? Or why should one hormonal profile automatically grant dominance? He even sort of playfully suggests, drawing on other thinkers, could we imagine a society where women's unique capacity to create and sustain life is seen as the ultimate source of power, making men envious and maybe subordinate?
That's a fascinating thought experiment.
It is, and it highlights how biological facts don't carry inherent social meaning. The meaning is applied culturally, it's interpreted.
That's a really powerful point. It shows our interpretations of biology are totally shaped by our social context, aren't they?
Absolutely. And this brings us to a really vital distinction that most social scientists use now, the difference between sex and gender.
Okay, let's nail that down because it feels absolutely fundamental to getting Kimmel's whole argument.
Definitely. So sex refers to the biological characteristics, our chromosomal makeup, our hormones, our anatomy. It's about being classified as biologically male or female. And from a purely biological standpoint, there's relatively little variation in the fundamental criteria across the human species.
Okay, biological apparatus. Got it. And gender, then.
Gender refers to the meanings, the expectations, the social roles that a particular culture attaches to those biological sex differences. It's about masculinity and femininity, what a specific society defines as appropriate or typical behavior, attitudes, identities for someone classified as male or female. And this is where you see incredible variation.
So while biological sex might be fairly universal, what it means to be male or female socially, culturally, that varies dramatically depending on time, place, culture.
Exactly. What counts as masculine or feminine differs profoundly across societies, across historical periods, even among different groups within a single culture. Anthropological studies, which Kimmel draws on heavily throughout the book, provide vivid examples of this huge variation. He previews this in talking about Chapter 3.
Like, you find cultures where men are expected to be, say, nurturing and emotional, or where women are the main economic providers and decision makers, things that might seem reversed from other cultural norms.
Right. And the crucial finding from anthropology is that the differences in gender meanings between two different cultures can actually be greater than the average differences between men and women within one specific culture.
Wow. Okay. That's strong evidence.
It really is.
Yeah.
It strongly suggests that gender is primarily a social and historical construct, not just a simple biological outcome. And that means we need the tools of social science and history to understand it properly.
Okay, so that addresses the biological nature argument pretty thoroughly. What about the social nurture side, the idea of differential socialization?
Right. The nurture argument, which he previews for Chapter 4, proposes that men and women are different because they are taught to be different.
Right.
From the moment they're born, sometimes even before birth, with gender reveal parties and all that.
Yeah.
Males and females are treated differently. They're encouraged towards distinct activities, different toys, different behaviors, different attitudes that their culture labels masculine or feminine. Through this lifelong process of socialization, we become different. We aren't born different in the ways that really matter socially.
And how does the nurture view explain the inequality part, the male dominance?
This perspective argues that domination isn't rooted in biology. It's not on the Y chromosome or anything. It's a consequence of the culture valuing traditionally masculine roles, behaviors, and experiences more highly than traditionally feminine ones.
Okay.
So by adopting these culturally defined gender roles, individuals internalize and kind of perpetuate this cultural hierarchy. The hierarchy where what women typically do or are is just considered less important, less powerful than what men typically do or are.
And this socialization isn't just something that happens in childhood and then stops, right? Developmental psychology comes in here too, pointing out how the meanings and expectations around gender change as people move through life.
Precisely. Puberty, starting a family, entering the labor market, retirement. The social script of gender isn't static. It evolves with age, with life circumstances, and with different social institutions people move through.
Now, here's where Kimmel makes his really pivotal move, isn't it? His critique of both the nature and the nurture explanations. He argues they actually share two fundamental and flawed assumptions.
Yes, and this is a core aha moment in his introduction, I think. The first shared assumption is that both biological determinism and differential socialization assume women and men are markedly different from each other. Like deeply, fundamentally, and in ways that are really significant. Even the socialization argument, while it allows for change in learning, still sees socialization as a process that necessarily creates distinct gendered individuals who are perceived as very, very different from each other. Both views essentially subscribe to some version of that interplanetary Mars-Venus theory.
So whether they point to hormones or toy choices, they both start from this baseline idea that men and women are fundamentally unlike each other.
Exactly. That's assumption number one. The second shared assumption is that gender domination is the inevitable outcome of gender difference. They both assume that difference causes inequality and power imbalances.
How so?
Well, biological views might say men's physical traits or hormones naturally lead to power. Socialization views might say our different learned roles and the way they're valued lead to unequal power. But in both cases, the causal arrow always points from difference to domination. Difference comes first, domination follows.
And Kimmel argues that both of these assumptions that we're fundamentally different and that difference causes domination are inadequate, maybe even just plain wrong. This is his central alternative thesis, right?
This is the core, yeah. His central, really game-changing idea is, first, that the differences among individuals of the same sex, the variation among women or among men, are actually much, much greater than the average differences between women and men as groups.
Okay, more difference within than between.
Right. And crucially, he completely reverses that causal arrow we just talked about. Gender difference is the product of gender inequality, not the other way around.
Whoa, okay, hang on. So the inequality comes first, and then we create or exaggerate the differences to kind of justify it.
That's the core insight. As the source puts it, quoting Kimmel, the very creation of difference is the foundation on which inequality rests. The system of inequality isn't a natural result of inherent differences. Rather, the idea of inherent difference is used to legitimize and maintain the unequal distribution of power and resources that's already in place.
Wow. And thinking about it that way has huge implications for how we approach social change, right? It must.
Oh, absolutely. It raises a really important question about political action. Look, if you believe difference causes inequality, then trying to fix inequality feels limited. You might think you can only soften the edges, maybe manage the system a bit better, because it's ultimately based on these fixed natural differences. You can't eliminate the root cause.
Right, you're stuck with the difference.
Exactly. But if you accept Kimmel's argument that inequality causes difference, well then, addressing and maybe even eliminating inequality has the potential to dissolve the very foundation upon which exaggerated difference is built.
That gives us a lot more leverage, doesn't it? More potential for real change.
It really does. And the hopeful vision Kimmel offers here is that eliminating inequality doesn't mean everyone becomes some, bland, androgynous, uniform entity. Not at all.
That's a common fear, I think.
It is. But he argues, instead, it allows the vast array of actual human differences based on things like race, class, ethnicity, age, sexuality, and yes, even biological sex differences, to exist and be appreciated in a context where both individual uniqueness and our shared humanity can flourish, without the constant pressure to conform to these rigid, unequal, exaggerated gender norms.
So it shifts the focus. Instead of trying to manage inherent differences, we should focus on dismantling the system of inequality that makes difference seem like such a huge defining problem in the first place.
Exactly. It's about understanding why we as a society are so invested in seeing and emphasizing gender difference all the time.
Speaking of seeing gender, or maybe not seeing it, that leads perfectly into another key idea from the introduction: making the invisible visible. Specifically, making gender visible for men. Now, for decades, feminist scholarship has worked incredibly hard to highlight gender as a fundamental organizing principle of society.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the past 30, 40 years of feminist work have been completely transformative. It's made it impossible, really, to ignore gender alongside race and class as crucial dimensions of social life.
Yeah.
By focusing on women's experiences, their contributions, their history stuff, often totally ignored in traditional scholarship. The lives of laundresses, housewives, forgotten figures.
Right.
They brought gender to the forefront of intellectual and political conversations. Essential work.
Totally essential. But, as Kimmel points out, there's a kind of curious irony here, isn't there? Even though gender is now a recognized field of study, if you look at who actually takes courses on gender studies in universities, it's overwhelmingly women.
Yeah.
It's almost as if only women have gender, are therefore the only ones interested in studying it. Men often feel targeted or like it's not about them in those spaces.
It's a really peculiar paradox. Because, men are often the dominant figures in positions of power, right? They're ubiquitous in public life, universities, politics, business. Historical narratives are full of men. Leaders, heroes, scientists.
Everywhere.
Everywhere you look. Yet, masculinity itself, the state of being a man and what that means socially, remains surprisingly invisible as a subject of serious study. Traditional history might be about kings and generals, who were men, obviously. But it's not typically about those kings and generals as men. It doesn't usually explore how masculinity shaped their actions or their worldviews or the structures they operated in. There's this, as Kimmel puts it, yawning gap in our understanding of masculinity itself.
So while we study the things men do, we don't often study what it means to be a man in that context and how that shapes their actions and the society around them. He uses some really striking literary examples from the source material to illustrate this.
Yes, he does. He notes that when we study, say, 19th century literature, a writer like Jane Austen or one of the Bronte sisters will almost certainly be analyzed through the lens of femininity, marriage plots, women's roles, and so on.
Makes sense.
But then you take Charles Dickens, who wrote constantly about fathers, sons, male family dynamics, anxieties about providing. He's typically analyzed for his social commentary or his narrative style or character development, but rarely specifically for gender or masculinity. Or Henry James, whose characters often wrestle with deep gendered anxieties, he studied for form and technique. While Edith Wharton, writing at the same time about similar themes, is studied for gender. It's like we act as if gender is only a relevant analytical tool when the subject is female.
It's like gender is only a marked category for women, right? The default human experience is assumed to be male and therefore somehow genderless. Like it doesn't need examining.
Precisely. That's exactly the point. So the call here, Kimmel says, is surely the time has come to make gender visible to men. He uses that great analogy. The fish are the last to discover the ocean. Masculinity is often the invisible water that men swim in. It's so pervasive, so normalized for them that its effects and its structures often go completely unnoticed by those who inhabit it most fully. It's the norm that doesn't seem to need a label.
He shares a really powerful personal story that illustrates this perfectly, his own kind of aha moment in a seminar back in the day.
Yes, it's a great anecdote. He recounts being in a seminar in the 1980s, and there was a discussion, a debate really, between a white woman and a black woman about whether all women share the same experience of oppression.
Okay.
The white woman felt they did. She said, when she looked in the mirror, she just saw a woman, and she felt that bonded her with the other woman, despite their racial difference.
Yeah.
But the black woman's response was incredibly profound. She said something like, "That's precisely the problem. When I look in the mirror, I see a black woman."
Wow.
Yeah. She explained that race was visible to her every single day because it was the basis on which she experienced disadvantage, how she was not privileged. But race was invisible to the white woman precisely because it was the source of her privilege. Being part of the dominant, unmarked racial category meant she didn't have to constantly think about her race.
And this was the light bulb moment for Kimmel regarding his own identity.
Exactly. He describes hearing this and having this internal groan, realizing that he, as a middle-class white man, had always seen himself as just a person, a generic human being, the default, without really thinking about class or race or, crucially, gender as shaping his experience. That conversation made him see himself, for the first time really, as a middle-class white man, someone whose perspective and experience were absolutely shaped by those very categories he previously thought were invisible or only applied to other people.
Privilege is invisible to those who have it. That's the takeaway.
That's the powerful takeaway. The things that give you an advantage in society are often the very things you don't have to think about or notice.
That's a really deep insight.
And he offers another really vivid analogy to make this point about invisibility and power, using something as mundane as U.S. email addresses.
Email addresses, how do they fit in?
Well, think about it. Email addresses in most countries around the world end with a specific country code, right? You've got .jp for Japan,
Yeah.
.uk for the United Kingdom, .de for Germany, DOS for South Africa, and so on.
Right.
But U.S. addresses typically just end with the domain. Type .edu, .com, .org, .gov. It's not random. Kimmel argues it's a subtle sign of dominance. When you are the dominant global power, you become the assumed standard, the generic entity. You don't need a specific country marker. Everyone else is marked as other, needing that specific label, that country code, to identify them relative to the default.
That's a fantastic, simple illustration of how dominance makes itself invisible to the dominant group. Privilege looks like the default setting.
Exactly. And this invisibility has really significant consequences. First, as we just talked about, the actual mechanisms of privilege, the systems that create inequality, remain hidden and unexamined, making it harder to challenge them.
Okay.
Second, and perhaps paradoxically, those who benefit from this invisible privilege, like many men in relation to gender, or many white people in relation to race, can become really defensive or even feel like victims when issues of sexism or racism are brought up.
Why is that?
Because their privilege is invisible to them, they don't see the systemic advantage they hold.
Yeah.
So when inequality is pointed out, they might interpret critiques not as observations about a system, but as personal attacks. Or they might see it as a zero-sum game, where addressing inequality feels like something is being unfairly taken away from them. It creates what one writer Kimmel cites called a neurotic oscillation between a sense of entitlement and a sense of unearned privilege.
And a third consequence is that standards that are actually gendered, often based on male experiences, end up appearing neutral or objective.
Yes, this is a critical point he emphasizes. He brings in the sociologist Georg Simmel, who wrote over a century ago about this. Simmel observed that many of the things we consider universally true, objective standards, whether in art, morality, law, science, knowledge, have historically been shaped primarily by men's experiences and perspectives, simply because men held the positions of power to define those standards. Simmel wrote quite bluntly, "If we call ideas that claim absolute validity objectively binding, then it is a fact that in the historical life of our species, there operates the equation, objective male."
Objective equals male. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a really stark way of putting it. It suggests that what we often hold up as neutral, unbiased truth is simply the male experience generalized and presented as the universal human experience.
Pretty much. And Kimmel gives a personal anecdote that illustrates this perfectly. From his own experience teaching, he was teaching a gender sociology class, and after hearing various perspectives, a student turns to him, the male professor, and says something like, "Finally, an objective opinion."
Oh, and interesting.
Right. Now, Kimmel argues he wasn't necessarily more objective than his female colleagues or the female students. But in that specific context, objective looked like him because men's perspectives have historically been coded and accepted as the universal default objective ones.
So, because men have historically held the positions of power and authority, defining knowledge, setting rules, their way of seeing the world, their standards, their experiences become the invisible benchmark against which everyone else, including women, gets measured.
Exactly. As Simmel observed, and Kimmel reiterates, man's position of power does not only assure his relative superiority over the woman, but it assures that his standards become generalized as generically human standards that are to govern the behavior of men and women alike. And this happens everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, in politics, in culture, everywhere.
And the consequences of this invisibility, this unexamined nature of masculinity, are pretty significant. Which brings us to our next point, gender in society and what Kimmel calls the current unacknowledged debate.
Yeah, he makes this really interesting argument that we, particularly in the United States, are actually having a massive national conversation about masculinity all the time, but we don't seem to realize it or name it as such.
How does he illustrate that? What kind of examples does he use to show this hidden debate?
He asks us to just think about what gender immediately comes to mind when we hear certain phrases in the news or public discussion. Phrases like teen violence, gang violence, suburban violence, even school violence.
The image that pops up is almost always male, isn't it? And often specifically younger men, sometimes poorer men, depending on the context.
Overwhelmingly male, right? Or think about terms like suicide bomber or terrorist hijacker. Again, overwhelmingly male image.
Okay.
But then he poses the crucial follow-up question. When commentators, politicians, experts discuss these issues, how often do they explicitly note that these are overwhelmingly problems involving young men? How often do they mention masculinity as a relevant factor in understanding why this violence is happening?
Almost never, really. It's striking when you think about it.
It's that sound of silence again, right? The invisibility of masculinity in public discourse, even when it's staring us in the face.
Does he give a specific example?
He does. He points to the commentary around the horrific murder of Matthew Shepard, the young gay student killed by two young men in Wyoming back in the late 90s. A sociologist quoted in the source material at the time attributed the violence to the youth variable.
The youth variable.
Yeah, framing it as just young people in general working out identity issues or making the transition away from home into adulthood. Jadenia, the fact that the perpetrators were young men committing a specific kind of hate-fueled violence, often perpetrated by men against perceived others, completely disappeared from that particular analysis. It got neutralized, reduced to a non-gendered youth variable.
And he points out, quite sharply, I imagine, how incredibly different the conversation would likely be if the genders were reversed in these scenarios.
Oh, absolutely. He asked us to do a thought experiment. What if problems like school shootings or gang violence or political terrorism were being primarily perpetrated by young women and the primary victims were boys or men?
Yeah.
He argues pretty compellingly, I think, that gender would be the only story. We'd be inundated with experts talking about female socialization, aggression in girls, maybe hormonal factors like PMS, female frustration, it would dominate the airwaves. But because it's young men committing violence that aligns, tragically, with some traditional, albeit extreme, masculine scripts, the analysis often just ignores gender entirely.
The example of the school shootings from that era, Columbine, West Paducah, Jonesboro, is really stark in its telling.
It is. He asks if girls had committed those horrific attacks and boys had been the primary victims, would the conversation have focused on vague ideas like the inherent violence of Soviet culture or just simply access to guns? Or would it have immediately focused on girls and femininity?
Probably the latter.
Almost certainly. And Kimmel suggests, provocatively, that the boys who did commit those acts were often, in a twisted way, performing a version of what American men are sometimes taught. You get even when you feel slighted, disrespected, or hurt. You assert power through violence. It's about enacting a particular destructive, gendered script for dealing with perceived injustice, which he explores much further in the book's chapter on the gender of violence, chapter 12.
Right.
And so his conclusion for this section is really clear. Until we make gender visible for both sexes, until we routinely include masculinity in our analysis of major social problems, we simply cannot adequately understand or address these critical issues.
It's not the only factor, he's careful to say.
No, definitely not. He stresses the importance of things like the global economy, class inequality, poverty, racism. Those are absolutely key. But ignoring the role of masculinity makes a complete understanding, and therefore effective solutions, pretty much impossible.
That powerfully underscores why studying men and masculinity isn't just some niche academic interest or a side note. It's actually crucial for understanding society and tackling some of its biggest, most pressing problems.
Yeah, it really highlights how much we miss, how much we fail to grasp when the dominant experience remains unexamined and invisible.
Okay, so we've looked at how gender difference is perceived. We've challenged the common explanations of nature versus nurture. We've understood why masculinity is often invisible. And we've seen the consequences of that invisibility in public discourse. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into what happens when we look beyond just simple male versus female differences. This brings us to point 5 in the outline, beyond the binary, talking about multiplicities and deceptive distinctions.
Right, so Kimmel starts questioning the very terms masculinity and femininity themselves. Using these singular terms, he suggests, can imply these simple universal definitions that supposedly apply to all men or all women, everywhere, all the time. And he argues this is just fundamentally inaccurate.
So this leads to the concept he refers to as the plural and the powerful. What does that mean?
Exactly. Taking a social constructionist approach seriously means recognizing that difference isn't just between men and women as monolithic groups. We absolutely need to explore the differences among men and the differences among women.
Okay.
Because these internal group differences, based on factors like race, class, ethnicity, age, sexuality, region, religion, you name it, are often more decisive in shaping an individual's actual lived experience and identity than the average differences between men and women considered as single, large groups.
So it's not just male versus female, it's recognizing the massive diversity within those broad categories.
Right.
It shatters the simple binary.
Totally. Experience isn't monolithic. I mean, think about it. The definition and experience of masculinity for, say, an older black gay man living in Chicago is going to be profoundly different from that of a young, white, heterosexual farm boy in rural Iowa, right?
Completely different worlds.
Absolutely. And similarly, a wealthy Asian American heterosexual woman working in tech in San Francisco will have a vastly different experience and understanding of femininity compared to, say, a poor white Irish Catholic lesbian working as a caregiver in Boston.
These other identities, these other social locations, they fundamentally modify how we experience gender. It's intersectional.
They're absolutely crucial. It's intersectionality in action. If gender varies so much across cultures, over historical time, among different groups within a single culture, and even across a person's own life course, well, then we cannot accurately speak of a single universal masculinity or femininity.
Makes sense.
So Kimmel argues we must speak of masculinities and femininities in the plural. We have to acknowledge the constantly changing, fluid, and incredibly diverse ways gender is constructed and lived by different groups and individuals across time and space.
Okay, that's the plural part, but then there's a powerful aspect of that concept. Even within all this plurality, this diversity, not all masculinities or femininities hold the same social weight or value, do they? There's a hierarchy.
That's exactly right. In any given society at any given time, there's usually a dominant definition, a kind of ideal model or standard that gets held up and reinforced as the right way to be a man or a woman. For men, this is often referred to as hegemonic masculinity, a term heavily associated with sociologists like R.W. Connell, drawing also on insights from people like Irving Goffman.
Okay, hegemonic masculinity. How is this dominant form defined? What does it look like?
Well, it's the form of masculinity that's culturally exalted, the one that holds the most prestige and legitimacy. But it's important to remember it's not necessarily what most men actually are or how they behave. It's an ideal.
Right.
And it's defined primarily in relation to, and often in opposition to, other subordinated masculinities, like those associated with gay men, men of color in racist societies, working class men, etc. And critically, it's defined in opposition to women and femininity.
Okay, so it defines itself by what it's not.
Largely, yes. Goffman's description, which Kimmel quotes, is incredibly telling and specific, though maybe a bit dated now in its particulars, but the idea holds. Goffman wrote, "In an important sense, there is only one complete unblushing male in America, a young, married, white, urban, northern, heterosexual, Protestant, father of college education, fully employed, of good complexion, weight and height, and a recent record in sports."
Oh, that is an incredibly narrow and specific definition of the ideal man.
It is. And Goffman adds that failing on any single one of those points makes men likely to feel, in his words, unworthy, incomplete, and inferior. It's an almost impossible standard for most actual men to fully embody, but it serves to define the ideal that sits at the top of the hierarchy of masculinities.
And is there a parallel concept for women, a dominant or idealized femininity?
Yes, Kimmel introduces the term emphasized femininity, also drawing heavily on Connell's work. Emphasized femininity is described as an exaggerated ideal of womanhood that is fundamentally organized around complying with gender inequality and actively accommodating the interests and desires of men.
Accommodating men's interests. Okay, what does that actually look like in practice? What kinds of traits or behaviors does it involve?
It often involves things like presenting oneself as sociable rather than overtly competent, perhaps appearing fragile or needing protection in certain contexts, being compliant or deferential in relationships with men, and accepting traditional roles like marriage and primary child care, often presented as a personal choice, but sometimes as an adaptation to systemic discrimination women face in other areas, like the workplace. It tends to stress traits like empathy, nurturance, and physical attractiveness, and often exaggerates gender differences as a way for women to navigate or adapt to men's structural power. The source material mentions how real womanhood is often described in terms that emphasize this performative aspect, this focus on being fascinating or desirable to men.
Kimmel includes a really striking example of this, doesn't he? That poem written by an 8-year-old boy imagining what it would be like to be a girl.
Well, yeah, it's incredibly insightful and frankly a bit sad. The poem goes something like, "If I were a girl, I'd have to attract a guy wear makeup, sometimes, wear the latest style of clothes and try to be likable."
Wow.
And it continues, "I probably wouldn't play any physical sports like football or soccer. I don't think I would enjoy myself around men in fear of rejection or under the pressure of attracting them."
An 8-year-old boy articulating that intense pressure to perform attractiveness and likability and that fear of rejection, that shows just how incredibly early these ideas about emphasized femininity are absorbed from the culture.
It really, really does. So putting it together, the idea of multiple masculinities and femininities, the plural part, helps us see the diversity within gender categories, breaking down the simple binary. But the idea of a hierarchy, the powerful part, with hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity at the top, actually reinforces Kimmel's central argument, that it's domination that creates and exaggerates difference. These idealized forms of gender are fundamentally shaped by and serve to uphold the existing power structures.
Okay, and this brings us to another absolutely fundamental concept that Kimmel highlights in the introduction, borrowing from the sociologist Cynthia Fuchs Epstein, the idea of deceptive distinctions.
Yes, this concept is absolutely key. If you get this, you really get the core of Kimmel's thesis. Deceptive distinctions are differences that we observe between groups, in this case, men and women, that appear to be caused by some inherent trait of the group members themselves, like their gender.
Okay.
But They are actually caused by the fact that those individuals are systematically channeled into different positions, different roles, or different contexts within the broader social structure.
Yeah.
It's the situation, the position, the structure that elicits the observed behavior, not necessarily some intrinsic male or female nature.
Okay, let me make sure I've got this. So what looks like a fundamental difference between men and women might actually be a difference between the roles they typically play or the environments they're usually in. The context is key.
Exactly. The old interplanetary theory says men act like Martians and women act like Venusians no matter where they are, right?
Yeah.
It's inherent. The deceptive distinctions argument says no, people act differently because one group is more likely to be put in the Mars context, maybe a competitive workplace, and the other group is more likely to be put in the Venus context, maybe primary caregiving at home. And those contexts themselves are shaped by inequality. Kimmel provides several really good examples from research to illustrate this.
Okay, let's hear them. The first one mentioned is in communication patterns, comparing the work of Deborah Tannen with that of William O'Barr.
Right. Tannen's hugely popular books, like You Just Don't Understand, described men and women as having fundamentally different communication styles and goals. Men use language competitively to establish status. Women use it collaboratively to build connection. Men talk more in public settings, women more in private. She often attributes this to different cultural upbringings, like boys and girls growing up in different gendered cultures.
Okay, that sounds familiar. But O'Barr's research, looking at language in courtrooms, offered a different explanation, right?
It did, yeah. O'Barr and his colleagues studied language patterns in court testimony. What they found was that many of the differences in language use, often attributed purely to gender, things like using hesitant language, hedges like I think or sort of, tag questions, intensifiers, were actually better explained by the witness's social position and relative power within that specific courtroom context.
Ah, so it wasn't just about being male or female, but about their status in that situation.
Precisely. For instance, using what was often called women's language, more hesitant, polite, less assertive, wasn't solely a female trait. It was used by people, both male and female, who are in less powerful positions in that context, like lower status witnesses compared to expert witnesses or judges.
So what Tenon might have interpreted as inherent women's language could actually be seen as powerless language.
It's exactly. O'Barr concluded that so-called women's language is neither characteristic of all women nor limited only to women. He argued that if women, statistically, use more powerless language features in the setting studied, it was likely because women were disproportionately occupying relatively powerless social positions in those very settings. We just rarely see, say, dependent men or female CEOs giving testimony in the same numbers to make a truly fair comparison across positions. The difference is deceptive. It's largely about power and position, not just gender identity itself.
That's a great example. Okay, another area mentioned is perceived differences in abilities like math or handling money.
Yes, often discussed in relation to classroom performance or financial behavior.
Yeah.
For years, lower average math scores for girls were sometimes attributed to internal psychological factors like math anxiety or even a fear of success, suggesting some kind of internal barrier linked to being female. Similarly, popular ideas, like those promoted by Colette Dowling in the Cinderella Complex, linked women's perceived difficulties with managing money to deep-seated psychological issues, suggesting that money savvy was inherently connected with masculinity and that women somehow unconsciously shoot themselves in the foot financially due to unresolved dependency conflicts.
But again, research counters this, framing these as deceptive distinctions.
Absolutely. Financial experts like Jane Bryant Quinn, who Kimmel cites, push back strongly against these psychological explanations.
Yeah.
Quinn famously argued that the Y chromosome is not a money management chromosome.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's a good line. Her point, backed by data, is that when you actually control for relevant structural factors, things like income level, years of work experience, age, access to financial information, men and women are generally equally capable at managing money.
So the differences aren't innate.
Not according to this view. For instance, young men and young women just entering the workforce might be equally confused about how 401k plans work. Differences might emerge later if, for example, women are more likely to leave the paid workforce for extended periods for childcare. If they do, they naturally lose years of experience dealing with workplace savings plans, investing, etc., compared to men who might stay continuously employed. It's the experience with the task gained through their structural position, like being employed, not their inherent gender, that predicts proficiency.
So again, differences in financial confidence or skill are often a product of differing opportunities, differing roles, differing levels of experience accumulated over a lifetime, driven by the gendered structure of society.
Exactly. And Kimmel also draws heavily on Rosebeth Moss Kanter's classic, groundbreaking research on workplace behavior, detailed in her book, Men and Women of the Corporation.
Right. And the stereotype there is often that men are the ambitious, competitive climbers, focused on hierarchy, while women are perhaps more cooperative, focused on relationships, maybe less driven by sheer ambition or fear success.
Exactly that stereotype.
Yeah.
But Cantor's key finding, based on meticulous observation within a large corporation, was that the observed behavioral differences between men and women in the workplace had far less to do with their gender per se, and far, far more to do with their structural position and level of opportunity within the corporation's hierarchy.
Really? How did that play out?
She found that women who were placed in positions with genuine opportunities for advancement, who had access to the same networks, mentors, and resources as men in similar positions, behaved well, just like the men. They were just as ambitious, just as competitive, just as focused on advancement. Conversely, and this is crucial, men who were stuck in dead-end jobs with little opportunity for promotion often behaved in ways that are stereotypically associated with femininity. They focused more on the social aspects of work, built strong peer relationships, were less overtly ambitious, sometimes seemed resigned.
So the perceived gender differences in workplace behavior were actually deceptive distinctions caused by the unequal opportunity structures within the company itself. People behaved according to their position and prospects, not just their gender.
Precisely. Cantor showed brilliantly that it was the structure of the corporation who got opportunities, who got blocked, that produced these apparently gendered behaviors, not some inherent difference between men and women's psychology or ambition.
That's powerful. Okay, and finally, Kimmel looks at the family and parenting roles, which he previews for Chapter 6. The common assumption here is often that women are naturally nurturing, inherently maternal, maybe due to biology or just intense socialization, while men are perhaps less emotionally expressive, the strong silent type, more focused on providing or being the disciplinarian.
Right, that's the standard script. But here again, research strongly suggests deceptive distinctions are at play. Kimmel cites important studies by people like Kathleen Gerson and Barbara Risman. Gerson's work on women's life choices, for instance, found that a woman's early gender socialization, how she was raised as a girl, was actually a surprisingly poor predictor of her later family life, like whether she became a stay-at-home mother or combined work and family.
Really? So what did predict it?
Factors related to her adult circumstances were far more important. Things like the stability of her marriage, her husband's income level or lack thereof, her own experiences and opportunities in the workplace, and the availability of social support networks like affordable childcare. These structural and situational factors mattered much more than how she was socialized years earlier.
So again, external circumstances and structural support seem more predictive than some deep-seated gender identity formed in childhood.
Yes. And Barbara Risman's work on single fathers is particularly compelling on this point. Despite being socialized as males in a culture that overwhelmingly associates nurturing and primary caregiving with femininity, Risman found that single fathers were perfectly capable of mothering.
Oh, so?
They performed the typically female-assigned domestic tasks, they engaged emotionally and attentively with their children, and they facilitated their children's development just as effectively, on average, as single mothers or mothers in two-parent households.
So her conclusion is basically that men can mother and children don't necessarily fare better just because their primary caregiver is female.
Exactly. Risman argues that when the structural conditions like being the sole responsible caregiver and the accompanying role expectations become similar for men and women, then the observable gender differences in parenting styles and effectiveness largely disappear. The context reshapes the behavior.
Kimmel also briefly touches on the example of reported stress levels, citing research by Almeida and Kessler, which found, I think, that women tend to report higher levels of stress and fewer stress-free days than men.
Yes, that's another common finding. And again, one might initially interpret this through gender stereotypes. Maybe women are just more emotional or less resilient to stress or something like that.
Right.
But Almeida and Kessler's conclusion, based on their detailed research, was clear. The difference wasn't due to inherent gender traits or biological inferiority. It was primarily because women, particularly women in heterosexual relationships with children, were disproportionately juggling more sources of stress simultaneously. As one researcher vividly put it, women often tend to the home, the plumber, their husband's career, their jobs, and oh yes, the kids, For many men in similar families, the primary source of stress reported was often just, how are things at work? The end.
They literally had more plates spinning, more demands on their time and energy.
Exactly. More structural demands leading to higher reported stress. And Kimmel poses that crucial, critical question. What if the study had compared, say, single mothers and single fathers? It's highly probable they would have found that juggling multiple, often conflicting demands generates enormous stress regardless of the parent's gender.
So in all these diverse examples, communication styles, handling money, workplace behavior, parenting approaches, even stress levels, the observed differences often aren't reflecting inherent fixed gender traits. They're frequently these deceptive distinctions. They're primarily caused by the different positions people occupy, the different roles they're expected to play, and the different opportunities and constraints they face within the broader social structure.
That's the core argument, as Barbara Risman summarizes it beautifully. If the structural conditions and the role expectations were truly identical for men and women, many, if not most, of the observable, statistically significant gender differences we routinely measure might largely dissipate or disappear altogether.
Okay, this is a really powerful argument that so much of what we perceive as fundamental gender difference is actually shaped by inequality and social structure. But Kimmel doesn't argue that absolutely all differences would vanish completely, does he? He leaves some room for nuance there.
That's an important clarification, yes. He acknowledges he isn't fully convinced that every single observable difference would just evaporate if we achieved perfect equality. Some differences, perhaps rooted in biology or complex interactions, might persist. But he wants us to be really precise about what we usually mean when we talk about differences in research and popular discussion.
And that usually comes down to talking about mean differences or averages, right?
Exactly. When research finds there's a gender difference in a particular trait, like maybe aggression levels or scores on an empathy scale, it rarely, almost never, means that all individuals of one gender are high on that trait and all individuals of the other gender are low.
It's not like two totally separate groups.
Not at all. It usually means there's a difference in the average score for the group of men compared to the group of women. For example, the average aggression score for men might be slightly higher than the average score for women.
Okay. But focusing just on that average difference doesn't tell the whole story, does it? It misses the variation, the range within each of the groups.
Precisely. And this is a huge point. Think about height, again, as an easy analogy. On average, men are taller than women. That's a clear mean difference. But we all know millions of women who are taller than the average man, and millions of men who are shorter than the average woman. The range of heights within the male group is enormous, and the range of heights within the female group is enormous. And crucially, there's a massive amount of overlap between the two distributions.
Right.
Now, apply that to psychological and behavioral traits. For most traits that have been studied, things like aggression, empathy, verbal skills, spatial skills, risk-taking, the scientific finding is consistent. The variation among individuals within the same sex is typically much, much greater than the average difference between the sexes.
So while there might be a small difference in the average score between men and women on, say, empathy, the vast majority of men and women are actually far more similar to each other on that trait than that small average difference would lead us to believe. The overlap is the main story.
Exactly. The overlap is huge. The within-group variation is huge. But our cultural tendency, and often the way research gets reported, is to focus almost exclusively on that small mean difference. We ignore the huge overlap and the vast within-group variation. And focusing only on that average difference feeds right back into that interplanetary theory, the idea that the differences between men and women are deep, fundamental, categorical, and insurmountable.
And this, Kimmel argues, is where the really interesting sociological puzzle lies.
Yes. For him, the most important question isn't just about figuring out where gender differences originally come from, whether it's biology or socialization or some complex mix. The deeper, more compelling sociological question is, why is gender difference so incredibly important to us as a society? Why do we cling so fiercely to the idea that men and women are fundamentally distinct categories? Why are books promoting the men are from Mars, women are from Venus idea perennial bestsellers? Well, a book titled something like, Hey everyone, we're all basically Earthlings, would probably struggle to find an audience.
It's the sociology of why we want or need to see difference, even when mountains of evidence suggest overwhelming similarity across most domains.
Exactly that. And Kimmel's powerful message, which he supports with a wealth of research that he synthesizes throughout the book, is that fundamentally men and women are from planet Earth. We are not opposite sexes, but rather neighboring sexes, to borrow a brilliant phrase from anthropologist Gail Rubin, which Kimmel quotes effectively.
Neighboring sexes, I like that.
Yeah, it captures it well.
Yeah.
We're far more alike than we are different. We share most of the same abilities, the same desires, the same needs, the same fears, the same hopes.
Rubin's quote that he includes really drives this point home forcefully, doesn't it?
It really does, she wrote. Men and women are, of course, different, but they are not as different as day and night, earth and sky, yin and yang, life and death. From the standpoint of nature, men and women are closer to each other than either is to anything else. For instance, mountains, kangaroos, or coconut palms.
Huh. Puts it in perspective.
It does. And her conclusion is even more pointed and aligns perfectly with Kimmel's thesis. Far from being an expression of natural differences, exclusive gender identity is the suppression of natural similarities.
Wow. Say that again. Exclusive gender identity is the suppression of natural similarities.
Yeah, the intense social pressure to conform to these exaggerated, often unequal gender roles forces us to hide or deny or suppress the vast range of behaviors, emotions, interests, and potentials that we actually share as complex human beings.
So believing that difference is fundamental, biological, intractable, that has significant political and social consequences. Because it limits our imagination for change, it naturalizes inequality. And Kimmel's argument aims to take us beyond just thinking about gender as an individual identity, about how we become gendered selves.
That's definitely an important part of the puzzle, right? How we learn the norms of masculinity and femininity, how we negotiate those expectations in our own lives. But Kimmel argues very strongly that we become these gendered individuals within and through gendered institutions.
Okay, gendered institutions, what does that mean exactly?
It means our major social organizations, our workplaces, our families, our schools, our political systems, religious institutions, the media, you name it. These aren't neutral spaces simply populated by individuals who happen to be male or female. These institutions themselves are sites where dominant definitions of gender are actively created, reinforced, and policed. They have structures, rules, norms, and cultures that uphold certain expectations about gender, and often discipline or disadvantage those who step outside those boundaries.
So the structures themselves are gendered, not just the people walking around inside them.
Precisely. Saying society is gendered isn't just about, noticing symbols like phallic skyscrapers or the feminine curves designed into a car, although those symbols matter. It means the fundamental design, the rules of the game, the very operation of our social organizations have evolved over time in ways that actively reproduce both the perceived differences between women and men and the historical pattern of male dominance.
Can you give an example of how an institution's structure does that?
Sure. Think about the standard structure of full-time professional work in many fields. The expectation of long hours, continuous employment, geographic mobility, the separation of work and home life. This structure often implicitly assumes a worker who has minimal non-work responsibilities, particularly caregiving responsibilities. Historically and statistically, this assumption relies on the gendered division of labor, where women were expected to be the primary caregivers, freeing up men for this kind of ideal worker commitment.
So the very layout of the typical professional career path implicitly assumes a traditional male life structure supporting it behind the scenes.
Exactly. And pretending these institutions are somehow gender neutral, right? Just objective platforms where individuals succeed based purely on merit actually helps maintain the existing gendered power dynamics. The idea that individuals, particularly women, can simply choose to express a wider range of behaviors or balance work and family differently and still succeed is often undermined when the institutions themselves are structured in a way that implicitly favors one gender's traditional life path or interaction style.
And this is where that concept of the double bind for women often comes into play, doesn't it? Especially when they enter historically male-dominated fields like corporate management, the military, politics, even certain sports.
Yes, it's a classic no-win situation, a catch-22,
Yeah.
created by the gendered nature of the institution. To succeed in these environments, women often feel pressured to adopt behaviors traditionally seen as masculine, being assertive, competitive, perhaps suppressing emotion, prioritizing work above all else. But then, they risk being criticized for being unfeminine, too aggressive, a bitch, maybe seen as sacrificing their identity, and potentially rejected socially or personally by both men and women. They're penalized for not conforming to feminine norms.
Okay, so that's one horn of the dilemma. What's the other?
The other horn is if they choose not to do that. If they try to retain or express behaviors and traits associated with traditional femininity, maybe being more collaborative, more empathetic, prioritizing relationships or work-life balance, they then risk being seen as Not serious, not competent, not tough enough for the demanding, implicitly masculine environment. Their perceived difference is then used to legitimize discrimination against them, holding them back from advancement.
So they're caught between two impossible, conflicting sets of expectations, both rooted in the fact that the institution itself is designed around a masculine norm. Damned if they do, damned if they don't.
Pretty much. And Kimmel gives a perfect everyday example of this. It really hits home.
Yeah.
The seemingly simple act of women dressing for work.
Ah, yes, the closet full of clothes, nothing to wear problem.
Exactly. Men might genuinely be puzzled by this common female complaint. Why? Because men's professional attire is relatively limited, codified, and generally designed to signal objectivity, seriousness, and conformity, like the standard uniform of navy, gray, or black suits. It doesn't require much thought for most men in those roles.
Right.
But women's clothing choices, Kimmel points out, are constantly being interpreted and signifying within a workplace that is still largely structured around masculine norms and the male gaze. One outfit might be judged as too frumpy or too masculine, leading to her not being taken seriously as a professional or perhaps even as a desirable woman. Another outfit might be judged as too slinky, too revealing, or too feminine, meaning she's only seen as a woman, as a sexual object perhaps, and therefore not taken seriously as a competent employee or leader.
Either way, she risks losing credibility because the unspoken standard for professional appearance is often subtly tailored to the male default, and female appearance is constantly under scrutiny in a way male appearance usually isn't.
Exactly. That simple example really brings home how the gendered nature of the institution itself creates these constant dilemmas and reinforces perceived and often problematic differences.
So it shows how both difference and domination are constantly being produced and reproduced, not just through what individuals learn growing up, but through our everyday interactions and maybe most fundamentally through the structures, the rules, the expectations embedded right into our social institutions.
That's the argument. The perceived differences become important. They matter, because the system makes them matter, even if the actual underlying differences between individuals aren't nearly as vast or categorical as we commonly assume.
So to kind of wrap up Kimmel's core message from this incredibly rich introduction, how would you summarize the stage he sets?
Well, I think his introduction really serves as a powerful manifesto for the rest of the book. He argues forcefully that much of what we take for granted as fundamental natural gender difference is actually, when you look closely, an outcome of gender inequality, not its cause.
Okay.
He challenges us, the readers, to look past the surface of these perceived differences, to question their origins. He aims to reveal which differences maybe aren't real or aren't as important as we think. And he makes a compelling case that the entire system of inequality provides the very foundation upon which the whole edifice of gender difference, especially exaggerated difference, is constructed and maintained.
Right.
So the book, building directly from this introduction, sets out to explore how these complex dynamics impact all of us as we navigate the process of becoming gendered people, living gendered lives within a deeply, persistently gendered society.
Wow. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive into just the opening arguments of the gendered society. We've really unpacked Kimmel's initial, quite radical challenge to the common-sense idea that gender differences are inherent and natural. We've seen his powerful counter-argument that inequality is often the cause, not the result, of difference.
Yeah, it really flips the script.
It does, and we've explored why masculinity can be surprisingly invisible, especially paradoxically, to those who benefit most from male privilege, and how those really interesting deceptive distinctions make differences that are actually caused by situations where structures look like they're fundamental gender traits.
And we've seen how this isn't just, some abstract academic exercise. Kimmel shows us quite clearly how our failure to see gender clearly for both men and women and our persistent assumption that differences are natural and fixed can blind us to the root causes of significant social problems. Everything from violence to workplace inequality to communication breakdowns.
It really forces you, doesn't it, to question those deeply ingrained assumptions we all carry around about men and women being these polar opposites from different planets. The research and the arguments he lays out right from the start suggest we are far, far more alike than we are different, and that many, maybe most, of the perceived differences we obsess over are actually shaped by the unequal structures and roles within society, not by some fixed biological or psychological divide.
And, that raises a really important question for you, the listener, to maybe consider as you go about your day. Think about your own life, right? The people you interact with, the workplaces or classrooms or communities you inhabit. Where have you observed what seemed like an obvious, maybe even frustrating difference between men and women,
Yeah.
perhaps in how they communicate, or approach parenting, or make decisions, or handle stress. Now, after hearing about Kimmel's ideas, especially about deceptive distinctions, could that difference you observed actually be one of those? Might it be driven more by the different roles people occupy, the different opportunities available to them, the different expectations placed upon them by a gendered system, rather than by some fixed, inherent male or female nature? It's worth asking, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And building on everything we've explored just from this introduction, here's maybe a final provocative thought for you to take away and mull over. If if Kimmel is right, or even partly right, that gender inequality is the fundamental bedrock upon which this elaborate edifice of exaggerated gender difference is built,
Hmm.
what does that truly imply about the potential for fundamental social change?
Hmm.
If we as a society were somehow able to succeed in significantly reducing, maybe even eventually dismantling, gender inequality, how might our very understanding, our lived experience of masculinity and femininity transform? What similarities between men and women, similarities that are currently perhaps suppressed, hidden, or discouraged by the intense pressure to conform to these exaggerated, unequal gender ideals, might finally be able to emerge, be recognized, and flourish in a more equitable world? What would that actually look like?